They had no idea what they were about to face. Mark and Lisa walked into this church with nothing but hope and belief that they had finally found a place to call home. A place where faith, love, and community would wrap around them like a blanket. They'd been searching for it for so long, and it felt right from the very beginning. The warm greetings at the door, the inviting smiles, the sense of belonging that washed over them. It felt like the church was more than just a building. It felt like a new chapter, a fresh start. They imagined long Sundays spent together, surrounded by people who cared, who would support them, who shared their values. They thought they'd found sanctuary. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. It only took one moment, one unexpected confrontation, and suddenly, they were standing at the edge of the church, forced to leave. A community they thought would embrace them had turned its back. The same people who had welcomed them just weeks ago were now looking at them with suspicion, with judgment. Mark and Lisa never saw it coming. Their journey to this church was supposed to be one of peace and acceptance, but what they found inside shattered everything they believed about the very faith they had trusted. In a world where they had hoped to find love, they were left with something far different, a truth that would change their lives forever. What happened inside this church? What could turn a place of worship into a place of rejection? They thought they were joining a community of believers, but in the end, they found that not all faith is created equal. What happens when faith is used as a weapon? For months, Mark and Lisa believed they had found something special. They had tried church after church, searching for a place where they could finally settle, where they could feel at peace with their faith and their place in the world. It wasn't just about the services or the teachings, it was about finding a community, a family, that would accept them for who they were. When they walked into this church for the first time, it felt different. It felt like a new beginning, as though they were stepping into a space where they truly belonged. Each Sunday, Mark and Lisa returned, drawn by the warmth they felt when they walked through the doors. The congregation didn't just say, "Hello." They reached out with genuine smiles, making them feel like part of something bigger. There were people who remembered their names, who took time to ask about their week, to talk about their lives. It wasn't just small talk. It felt real. It felt like they had found a family. They spent time together outside of Sunday services, too. It wasn't just about the shared prayers or the hymns, it was the simple things. Sitting in the back pew, enjoying a quiet moment together, watching the children's choir practice, volunteering to help set up for events. Every week, Mark and Lisa found themselves drawn more deeply into the life of the church. They shared meals with other members, laughing over Sunday lunches, sharing stories and experiences that stretched beyond the walls of the church building. The sense of unity was undeniable. They were becoming part of something, part of a group of people who saw them, who cared for them, who valued their presence. They could see the love in the eyes of the people around them, hear it in the voices of the congregation during every prayer, every hymn, every handshake. This was supposed to be a place where love flourished, where faith and compassion stood at the forefront. For Mark and Lisa, it felt like a safe haven, a place where they could grow together, where they could be accepted just as they were. Lisa looked at Mark one Sunday, after church had ended, as they walked out with new friends by their side. She smiled, a smile that came from deep within. "I feel like we finally belong here," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Mark, his arm around her as they walked toward their car, nodded with a look of quiet certainty. "Yeah, I think this is the place. These people seem genuine." It was more than just a place of worship to them now, it was home. It was everything they had been searching for, a reflection of what they had always imagined faith could be. Open, inclusive, filled with love. They had no idea that the peace they felt would be shattered, that the community they had come to trust would soon feel like a distant memory. The church that once felt like a home to Mark and Lisa began to change in ways they couldn't quite explain. At first, it was small things, a look here, a tone there. They brushed it off, convinced it was just the normal ebb and flow of life in any large congregation. They had always been taught that church was a place where love was meant to overcome all differences. But over time, Mark and Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It all started with the pastor. When they first heard him speak, his voice had been warm and inviting, a guiding presence in the church. But now, as the weeks went by, there was something different about the way he carried himself. His sermons, once full of hope and compassion, started to shift. The words still had a surface layer of kindness, but there was an undercurrent, a quiet tension that no one had really noticed at first. One Sunday, as Mark and Lisa sat in their usual pew, they watched as the pastor stood at the pulpit, delivering his message. His voice, strong and commanding, filled the room, but the warmth that had once been there seemed to have faded. Sometimes, we have to be careful about who we let into our fold, the pastor began. We have to watch for those who may have other agendas. There was a brief pause as he scanned the congregation, his eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd, lingering just a moment longer on certain individuals. Some people come here for the wrong reasons. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, as if they were meant for more than just the sermon. Mark and Lisa exchanged glances, the tension palpable between them. Neither of them had ever heard the pastor speak like this before. Lisa leaned closer to Mark, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he talking about us?" Mark's face tightened, the unease settling in his chest. He wasn't sure what to say, but he couldn't shake the growing discomfort. "I don't know, but I'm starting to feel uncomfortable." At first, it seemed like just an isolated comment, one that might have been directed at someone else, someone who hadn't been there long enough to understand. But over the next few weeks, things didn't feel quite the same. It wasn't just the pastor's words anymore. It was the way the congregation reacted. The subtle glances, the hushed conversations when Mark and Lisa walked by. In the warmth that had once greeted them, there was now an unspoken distance. People who had once smiled at them now turned away, or worse, didn't look at them at all. It wasn't just the pastor's words that had changed, it was the way the church felt. And as time went on, Mark and Lisa started to notice more than just the glances. They began to hear the whispers, too. They could feel the shift, but they couldn't explain it. It was like a shadow had settled over them, something that hung just out of sight, yet followed them everywhere. During church events, when Mark and Lisa tried to join in conversations, there were moments of silence. Moments when people would look away, avoiding eye contact. It was like they had entered a space where they no longer belonged, where their presence was no longer welcomed. At one potluck dinner, Mark tried to join a group of people he had become friendly with over the past few months. As he stepped into the circle, he noticed the sudden stillness, the laughter that had been flowing just moments before came to a halt. People shifted uncomfortably, and a few began to walk away without a word. It wasn't blatant, it wasn't direct, but it was there, an uncomfortable silence that felt as sharp as any words could be. Lisa, who had been standing a little further away, caught Mark's eye. She could see the change in his face. The smile that had been there just a few minutes ago was gone, replaced by a look of confusion and hurt. "What just happened?" she whispered when he walked over to her, his face pale. "I don't know," he replied, shaking his head. "But it doesn't feel right." They began to question whether they were imagining things. They had been welcomed into this community so easily at first. Why was everything starting to feel so different now? But the more they thought about it, the more they realized that something was slowly shifting. And it wasn't just about a few cold shoulders here and there. It was something deeper, something that they couldn't ignore anymore. The pastor's words echoed in Mark's mind long after that Sunday. Sometimes, we have to be careful about who we let into our fold. What did he mean by that? And why did it feel as though those words were being directed at them? As much as they tried to push the thought aside, the unease only grew. Mark and Lisa could feel the coldness in the air now, more noticeable with every passing week. It wasn't in their heads. It wasn't a fleeting discomfort. It was real. There were moments when they would turn a corner after a service and find small groups of people whispering behind their backs, their eyes darting away when Mark and Lisa approached. It wasn't overt, nothing they could point to directly, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time they walked into the church, the atmosphere seemed to change. What was once a place of acceptance now felt like a place where they were being quietly excluded. They had joined this church because they believed in its message of love, of unity. They had imagined it as a space where they could grow, where they could build something meaningful, something good. But now, with every passing day, the walls that had once felt so welcoming were beginning to close in. Mark's discomfort turned into something more, a sense of betrayal that he couldn't shake. He began to wonder if the pastor's words were meant for people like them all along. People who had thought they were accepted, but were never truly wanted. Lisa felt the same, though she struggled to put it into words. Every glance, every whisper, every uncomfortable silence at church felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. They couldn't help but wonder. Was this still the place they had once thought it was? Or had they missed something? Was this truly a community of faith, or was it a space where people like them were never meant to belong? As weeks went by, the changes became harder for Mark and Lisa to ignore. The subtle discomfort had evolved into something more obvious, more cutting. It wasn't just the pastor's words during sermons anymore, it was his presence, his gaze, his attitude. And it wasn't just about them. It was about the way the church had shifted. What had once been a place of warmth and open arms now felt like a place where they didn't belong. They began to notice more and more that they were no longer being invited to the activities they once enjoyed, no longer included in the conversations that had once felt so natural. People were polite, but distant. Warm, but guarded. The breaking point came one evening, at a church meeting where they had volunteered to help with the planning. It was just a small gathering, some of the regular members, the pastor, and a few new volunteers. Mark and Lisa arrived, expecting the same sense of community they had come to cherish, ready to pitch in and be part of things. But as soon as they entered the room, they felt it, an undercurrent of discomfort that seemed to stretch through the air, thickening with each passing minute. The pastor, who had been the heart of the church's community once, now stood off to the side, his eyes scanning the room with a distant, almost cold detachment. He didn't greet them the way he had before. He didn't offer a smile or even a polite acknowledgement. Instead, he barely looked in their direction, as though they had become invisible to him. The tension was impossible to ignore, and Mark and Lisa exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear now, something had changed, but neither of them could yet grasp what. Finally, after the meeting, the pastor asked to speak with them privately. Mark and Lisa, unsure of what was coming, agreed to step aside. They followed him into his office, a small, dimly lit room at the back of the church. The door shut softly behind them, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. But the pastor's demeanor was colder than ever. This was not the man who had welcomed them with open arms months ago. The conversation began in a manner that seemed almost routine, a quiet exchange of pleasantries. But Mark and Lisa could tell something was off. The pastor's tone was different, sharper, more deliberate. "I'm not sure this is the right place for you," the pastor began, his words cutting through the silence in the room. Lisa's heart sank. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft, yet desperate for understanding. "We've done nothing wrong. We just want to be part of the church." The pastor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, watching them with an expression that made them both feel smaller, more insignificant. His gaze was cold now, as though the kindness he had once extended had been a facade, one that had long since peeled away. "You see," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing heavier than the last, "we have a certain kind of community here, and it's not what you might expect." Mark's stomach turned. He could feel the walls closing in around them, the familiar sense of rejection creeping into his bones. But he needed to understand. "What kind of community are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and growing fear. The pastor's eyes hardened, his posture rigid. "I think you both know what I mean," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "This church isn't a place for everyone. I'm asking you to leave." Mark and Lisa stood there in stunned silence, unable to fully process what was happening. The words, so blunt, so final, hung in the air like a blow neither of them could have anticipated. The man they had trusted, the man they had admired for his faith, his leadership, was now sending them away. Without explanation, without remorse. Lisa's heart raced, and her thoughts swirled in confusion. "But, we've done nothing wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We've been nothing but respectful. We love this place. We love these people." But the pastor's response was cold, almost dismissive. "It's not about respect," he said, his voice cutting through her words. "This church has a certain way of being, a certain community. And you don't fit here." Lisa wanted to argue, to plead for an explanation, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't understand it. Why? Why now? Why after everything they had given to this church, everything they had believed in? Mark stood beside her, feeling the sting of betrayal deep in his chest. He looked at the pastor, trying to find any trace of the man who had once seemed so genuine, so full of kindness. But there was nothing. The man standing before them was a stranger, a person who had never truly seen them for who they were. The room felt colder than it ever had before, and Mark couldn't bring himself to speak. There was no room for dialogue, no space for explanation. It was final. The pastor had made up his mind. And just like that, the church that had once been a sanctuary had turned into a place of exclusion, of hurt. They stood there, stunned, silent. The pastor didn't offer any comfort, didn't try to explain his decision. He simply gestured to the door, as though the matter had been settled. Lisa, still holding onto a shred of hope, looked at him one last time. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked, but the pastor only shook his head. "No. You've been asked to leave," he said flatly, with no trace of empathy. Mark and Lisa left his office in silence, their hearts heavy with the weight of the betrayal. As they walked down the hallway, the familiar sounds of the church, people laughing, greeting one another, felt like they were from another world. It no longer felt like a place where they belonged. The world they had built in their minds, the world where this church was a safe haven, was crumbling. The truth had come out, stark and clear. This church was never meant for them. And just like that, the dream they had so carefully built had been shattered. What had once been a place of acceptance and belonging had now become a place of rejection and exclusion. The warmth they had once felt was replaced with the cold reality of a community that had never truly welcomed them at all. As Mark and Lisa stepped out of the church, the weight of their departure settled heavily on their shoulders. They had never imagined that the place they had come to trust, where they had laughed, prayed, and volunteered, would ever become the setting for their rejection. But now, with the church doors closing behind them, they felt the sting of betrayal in every step they took away from the building that had once felt like home. It wasn't just the pastor who had turned his back on them. It was the entire community. As they walked down the church's front steps, the eyes of the congregation followed them, but no one spoke up. Some looked away, as if they hadn't seen the injustice happening right before their eyes. Others stood frozen, uncomfortable with the scene but too frightened to say anything. The silence that surrounded them was louder than any words could have been. Lisa's tears were silent, but they spoke volumes. Her chest tightened with the hurt of it all. She had truly believed this church was a place of love. She had felt the embrace of a family here, people who welcomed them with open arms, shared meals, and encouraged each other to grow in faith. Now, as she walked away, she couldn't help but feel as if everything she had trusted had been a lie. "I thought this was a place of love," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was a question, one that hung in the air as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She could feel the tears welling up again, but she didn't want to cry in front of Mark. She didn't want to show how deeply the rejection had cut. Mark, walking beside her, had his jaw clenched tightly. His mind raced, replaying the moment in the pastor's office over and over, trying to grasp the full weight of the words that had been spoken to them. He wanted to shout, to scream at the injustice of it all, but he knew that would only give the pastor and the church the power to silence them further. His anger simmered just below the surface, but he kept it in check, determined not to let it break him down. "It's not just about us," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "This is bigger than that. He's poisoning everything this place was supposed to stand for." Lisa looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of sadness and disbelief. She knew he was right. It wasn't just them that had been rejected, it was the very ideals of love, acceptance, and community that the church had claimed to uphold. The values they had come to believe in had been twisted, distorted into something ugly. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. They walked in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders. The air between them was thick with all the things they didn't know how to say, all the questions they couldn't answer. But neither of them spoke the words that were so clearly on their minds. They both felt the same thing. The sting of having given so much to a place that had promised so much, only to have it turn its back on them when they needed it most. As they walked farther from the church, the distance between them and the building grew. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and each step they took felt like it pulled them further away from the life they had imagined for themselves in this community. Their minds raced with the questions they couldn't find answers to. Was this how faith worked? Was this the love they had heard so much about? Or had they been fooled by a false promise? They stopped for a moment, standing in the parking lot, the building looming in the distance behind them. The world felt empty, hollow, and the reality of what had just happened settled in like a weight they couldn't shake. They were on their own now. How could they do that? Lisa finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How could they just kick us out like that? Mark didn't know how to answer her. He wanted to say that he had been surprised, that he hadn't expected it. But that wasn't entirely true. He had felt something change in the air over the past few months. He had seen the small signs, the looks, the whispers. He just hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. But now, standing here with Lisa by his side, it was impossible to ignore. They had been excluded. They had been discarded. I don't know, Mark said, shaking his head slowly. I don't understand. I thought they were better than this. I thought this place meant more. Lisa nodded, wiping away the tears that had started to fall again. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The hurt was still there, deep inside, but there was something else, too. Something that Mark could see in her eyes. There was a quiet strength that was beginning to emerge. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something bigger, something that wasn't going to let the pastor's cruelty define them. We can't just walk away, Lisa said, her voice growing steadier now. We can't let them win. Mark looked at her, surprised by the resolve in her words. She had been hurt, just as much as he had, but there was a fire in her now, a sense of purpose that he hadn't expected. He nodded slowly, a sense of determination settling in his chest. You're right, he said. We can't let them do this. We have to stand up for what we believe in, for what this place was supposed to be. They didn't know exactly what that meant yet, what steps they would take or how they would find a way forward. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to let the actions of one man in a church full of silent bystanders define their faith. They weren't going to let the hate they had encountered rewrite their understanding of community, of love, or of belonging. And so, with that quiet strength in their hearts, they turned their backs on the church they had once believed in, walking into an uncertain future but holding on to the hope that there was still a place where love truly lived, where faith truly mattered. Together, they would find it. Together, they would rebuild their belief in a better tomorrow. As the days passed, Mark and Lisa found themselves in a new and unfamiliar place. The world they had once known, the community, the sense of belonging, the faith they had put their trust in, had been shattered in a single moment. The rejection wasn't just a personal blow. It was a direct assault on their beliefs, their identity, and their hope for a future that was built on acceptance and unity. They were left to wrestle with the question that lingered in their minds. What now? They knew they couldn't simply walk away, not without doing something. The injustice they had experienced wasn't something they could simply forget. It had to be confronted. They could no longer stay silent, even if it meant standing alone. So, they made a decision. They would speak out. The first step wasn't easy. There were moments when they questioned whether their voices would even matter. But with each conversation, with each person they spoke to, something shifted. They began to realize that their pain was not an isolated experience. It wasn't just about them being kicked out of a church. It was about something far greater, the hatred and division that had taken root in places where people were supposed to find solace. The injustice they had faced was not unique. It was a reflection of a larger problem. Lisa, her voice trembling with the rawness of the experience, found herself speaking at local community events, telling their story to anyone who would listen. At first, she had felt nervous, unsure whether anyone would understand. But soon, her nerves were replaced by a deep sense of purpose. She could see the faces of others in the crowd, people who had been hurt, silenced, or ignored. They nodded in quiet understanding, their eyes filled with empathy. These were people who had their own stories of rejection, their own experiences with injustice. And for the first time, Lisa felt like she wasn't alone. We can't just sit back and let this happen to others, she said to Mark one evening, her voice strong, determined. We have to speak up. We have to tell people what's going on. Mark listened quietly, his hand resting on hers as they sat together in their small living room. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had been ignited in him too. It wasn't just about getting back at the pastor, or seeking revenge. It was about shedding light on the truth, about showing others that this kind of hatred and division should never be tolerated, no matter where it happened. It's not just about us, Mark replied. It's about more than what happened in that church. It's about showing people the truth. People need to know what's really going on inside. Their voices, once quiet with doubt, now rang with conviction. They knew they couldn't change the past, but they could fight for a future where this kind of hurt was no longer allowed to thrive. They could raise their voices and let others know that no matter how small or big the church, no matter how far removed the community, hatred and exclusion could not, and would not, stand unchecked. The more they spoke out, the more they realized that they weren't the only ones who had felt the sting of rejection from a place that was supposed to represent love. Slowly, they began to find others, people who had faced similar experiences. Some had been rejected for their beliefs, others for their appearance, some simply for being different. Each story was a thread, weaving together a larger tapestry of pain and injustice. And through these voices, Mark and Lisa found solidarity, a sense that their fight was part of something much larger than themselves. At first, the voices of the people who supported them were quiet, those who had heard their story and who quietly nodded in agreement but hesitated to speak out themselves. It was hard to push back against an institution so deeply rooted in tradition, so tightly connected to the community. But Mark and Lisa weren't about to give up. They began to attend local community meetings, speaking openly about their experience. They met with allies who shared their desire for change, for understanding. They built a network of people, each one committed to challenging the hate that had taken root in the church they had once loved. As they began to make their voices heard, they also made a decision that felt like a reclaiming of their lives, their faith, their values, and their belief in the goodness of people. They sought out a new church, one that embraced diversity and inclusivity, where love wasn't just preached from the pulpit but lived out in every action. It wasn't the same as the place they had left behind. It wasn't perfect, and it would take time to heal the wounds of their past, but it was a start. The first step toward rebuilding what had been lost. The new church they found was different. The people there didn't just speak about love and faith. They lived it, day in and day out. The warmth of the congregation was palpable. They weren't just welcomed in, they were embraced, encouraged to share their gifts and talents, to take part in the work of building a community grounded in compassion and kindness. For Mark and Lisa, this wasn't just a new church. It was a place of healing, a place where they could begin again. The transformation wasn't immediate. There were still nights when they stayed awake, wondering what could have been, asking themselves how they had ended up in such a painful place. But with each new person they met in their new church, with each new ally they found, they realized that they had made the right choice. They were not defined by the rejection they had faced. They were defined by the love and the community they were now part of. It wasn't just about healing their own hearts, it was about finding strength in others, coming together to fight for a world where everyone could feel seen, heard, and loved, regardless of race, background, or where they came from. This was bigger than Mark and Lisa. It was about creating a world where faith and love weren't just empty words but actions, where churches were not places of exclusion but havens for everyone, where every person was embraced, not rejected. They had fought back, and in doing so, they had found something far greater than just a new church. They had found hope again. As the days passed, Mark and Lisa began to see the full scope of the impact their decision had made. It started small, a few conversations here and there, quiet whispers from people who were beginning to question what they had once accepted without question. It wasn't just about their own pain anymore. What they had experienced in that church had sparked something larger, a growing awareness that what had happened to them was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much bigger issue. They began meeting with former members of the church, people who had walked away, those who had left years ago, and others who were still attending but began to see things differently. Some of these individuals had seen the subtle changes in the pastor's sermons, the way certain people in the congregation were treated, the way certain voices were never heard. They had felt the discomfort long before Mark and Lisa ever stepped into the picture. But until now, they hadn't known what to do, how to speak up. Fear had kept them silent. The first of these conversations was in a small, quiet cafe, with a former church member who had left the congregation years ago. Her eyes were tired, worn down by years of conflict within the church. She had stayed long enough to witness the slow shift in the atmosphere, but when the pastor's rhetoric became impossible to ignore, she had left. "I didn't see it at first," she admitted, her voice soft but determined. "But now I can't ignore what's happening. It's like I was blinded by what I wanted to believe. But I see now." Lisa nodded, listening intently. "We need to change things from the inside. We can't just walk away. That's not enough anymore." Her words were both a plea and a call to action. They were rallying others to join them, to be a part of something bigger than their own fears or doubts. Lisa had always believed that real change started with the people closest to the issue. She didn't want to just expose the injustice, she wanted to help those still trapped in that toxic environment see it for what it was. Word spread. More people began reaching out. Some were still in the congregation, quietly observing, unsure of how to act. Others had already left, but their hurt was still raw, still fresh. They too had been pushed aside, dismissed, or marginalized in one way or another. In each conversation, Mark and Lisa saw something they hadn't expected. A spark of recognition, a sense that they weren't alone in their experiences. That pain, that sense of betrayal, it wasn't just theirs. It was shared by many. In the weeks that followed, their circle grew. They met at local parks, in living rooms, at community centers, anywhere that felt like a safe space to gather. These weren't big meetings, but the impact was undeniable. People began to find their voices again, to stand up and say what had been unsaid for so long. It was clear. Something had to change. One evening, a small group gathered in a church basement, a few familiar faces, but many new ones. People who had found the courage to stand up, to finally confront the issue that had been festering for so long. Mark spoke first, his voice steady but full of emotion. We can't let what happened to us happen to anyone else. We can't let this church, our community, become a place where hatred is allowed to flourish. It's not just about us anymore. It's about the future of this place, this community. We need to take action. Lisa's voice followed, quieter, but resolute. We can't be afraid anymore. We can't wait for someone else to do it. If we want change, it starts with us. We've seen what this pastor is capable of. We've felt it, but we have the power to change it. We just have to be willing to act. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of their words settling over everyone. And then one by one, voices began to rise. People who had been silent for so long now spoke out, some for the first time, sharing their own stories of exclusion, of uncomfortable moments, of the quiet ways the pastor's behavior had shifted over time. For some, this was an awakening. For others, it was a painful reckoning. But no matter the experience, they all shared the same desire: change. One woman, who had been attending the church for decades, spoke up, her voice trembling at first, then growing more firm with each word. I've been coming here for 25 years. I've seen the good and the bad. And I thought I was just imagining things, or that it was just a phase. But now I see what's been happening. I can't just sit back anymore. The room nodded, the connection between them undeniable. In that moment, Mark and Lisa realized that they were no longer alone in their fight. They had gathered people who shared their vision for a better, more inclusive community. One where everyone felt valued, where faith wasn't used as a tool to divide but as a source of strength and unity. It wasn't going to be easy. They knew that. The system they were up against was entrenched, powerful. But the more they spoke, the more they felt the power of collective action. The group wasn't large yet, but it didn't need to be. Their voices were strong, and that was all that mattered. But it wasn't just about organizing meetings or collecting signatures. It was about reaching the people who were still inside the church, the ones who didn't yet see the truth, or who were too afraid to speak out. It was about showing them that they had the power to create change, to demand accountability, to stand up for what was right. And so, Mark and Lisa, along with their new allies, began to take the conversation to the next level. They started holding discussions in local parks, inviting those still in the congregation to join, to listen, to reflect. They knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but every conversation, every voice raised in unity, was a step closer to making it a reality. The message they carried wasn't one of destruction, it was a message of hope. It was about reclaiming their faith, about reminding the community what it had once stood for. It was about making sure that no one else would feel the sting of exclusion like they had. Together, they could make a difference. And slowly, but surely, the ripple effect of their efforts began to spread. Other churches, other communities, even local organizations took notice. The conversation shifted. People began to ask themselves difficult questions. What had they allowed to happen in their own communities? Had they turned a blind eye to the subtle ways hatred and division had crept into their lives? It wasn't just Mark and Lisa's fight anymore. It was the fight of anyone who had ever felt pushed aside, ignored, or oppressed. And they were ready to stand up together. As the weeks turned into months, Mark and Lisa found themselves walking a new path, one that they hadn't expected to take. But the road they were now on felt different, felt right. The pain of their rejection had not disappeared, but with each step forward, they began to feel something else grow in its place. A quiet, steady strength that only comes from the peace of knowing you are where you truly belong. They walked into a new church one Sunday morning, small but warm, with a community that felt entirely different from the one they had left behind. There were no whispered judgments, no awkward silences, no uncomfortable glances exchanged when they entered the room. Instead, there was a sense of openness, of genuine welcome. People greeted them with smiles, invited them to join in, and made them feel as though they had always been a part of this place. In that church, Mark and Lisa found something they had never expected to find in the wake of their rejection, a true sense of belonging. The difference was undeniable. The pastor, a kind and compassionate woman, spoke from the heart, teaching not only about faith but about love, unity, and acceptance. It wasn't a place built on walls or exclusion, it was a place where everyone's voice mattered, and no one was made to feel less than. It was here, in this new place, that Lisa felt the weight of her own thoughts finally start to lift. She could breathe again. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," she said quietly, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "A place where people actually see us for who we are." Mark stood beside her, his arm around her shoulder, looking out at the congregation. There was a quiet, knowing smile on his face. "Faith isn't about the building," he said, addressing the small group gathered around them. "It's not about the pastor, or the choir, or the stained glass windows. It's about finding people who will stand with you in the face of hate, in the face of anything that tries to tear you down. That's what true community is." As the words left his mouth, the congregation nodded in understanding. Mark and Lisa's journey had brought them to this place, and as they looked around, they realized that this wasn't just a church, it was a home. They had found people who didn't just talk about love and acceptance, they lived it. For Mark and Lisa, this church was everything they had hoped their old one would be. It was a place where the message of faith wasn't twisted into something divisive, something harmful. It was a place where they were seen as equals, not as outsiders. And it was a place where they could begin to heal, together. They knew the road hadn't been easy. The scars of their experience would always be there, reminders of the betrayal they had suffered. But they had learned something important along the way. Faith wasn't about the institutions we belong to. It wasn't about buildings or names or titles. It was about the people we choose to surround ourselves with, and the values we choose to live by. True faith wasn't about adhering to a set of rules or rituals. It was about love, understanding, and standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Mark and Lisa's journey had shown them the power of speaking out, of finding courage in the face of overwhelming odds. They had lost something along the way, something that was once sacred, but in the process, they had gained something far more valuable. The knowledge that they were not alone, and that the strength of a community comes not from what it excludes, but from what it embraces. In their new church, they began to take on new roles, not as the couple that had been hurt and rejected, but as the couple who had fought for something better. They volunteered with the children's ministry, helped organize community outreach programs, and offered their voices whenever needed. They became leaders, not because they sought power, but because they understood what it meant to fight for a community that was truly inclusive, truly loving. The healing didn't happen overnight. There were still moments of doubt, still reminders of the church they had left behind. But each day, as they walked through the doors of their new church, they felt a little more whole, a little more at peace. They had found a place where they could be themselves, where they could express their faith without fear of being judged or turned away. And, more importantly, they had found a place where they could make a difference, where their voices could be used to uplift others, just as they had been uplifted. For Mark and Lisa, their story was far from over. They had learned that faith is not just about the rituals or the traditions. It's not about any one person or any one place. Faith is about finding those who will walk beside you when the world feels heavy, those who will lift you up when you've been knocked down, and those who will stand with you when it feels like everything else is falling apart. And so, they began to look forward. They didn't know exactly where their journey would take them, but they knew one thing for certain. They would never let the hate of others define their faith again. They would keep fighting for a world where love, understanding, and acceptance would always have a place. Their story wasn't just a story of personal hardship, it was a story of resilience, of finding hope in the darkest of places. It was a reminder to everyone who had ever felt rejected or excluded that there was always another way. a better way. And with the right people by your side, you could find it. Mark and Lisa's story was far from the end. It was a new beginning, one filled with possibilities, filled with hope. They had taken the pain of their past and turned it into a beacon of light for others who might one day walk the same path. And in doing so, they had found something more precious than they could have ever imagined. A community that loved them, not for what they had lost, but for who they had become. And perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest lesson of all. As Mark and Lisa stand together in this new church, surrounded by the warmth and support of their new community, there's a sense of peace that was missing before. The weight of their past experience, the hurt, the rejection, the betrayal, still lingers in their hearts, but it no longer defines them. It's the love, the understanding, and the strength they have found here that matters now. Together, they stand tall, their faces reflecting a hope they thought had been lost. They've weathered the storm, and now, they are stronger for it. But their journey, their story, is not just about them. It's about every person who has ever felt unwelcome, who has ever been cast aside because they didn't fit into someone else's narrow view of the world. It's about every individual who has had to make the difficult decision to stand up, speak out, and fight for what's right, even when the cost is high. So, I ask you, what would you do if you were in Mark and Lisa's shoes? Would you remain silent, allowing hate and division to fester? Or would you stand up, speak out, and fight for justice, for love, for inclusion? Would you have the courage to walk away from a place that promised sanctuary but delivered something else entirely? This is the question they faced, and in the end, it was their voices, their unwavering commitment to doing what was right, that made all the difference. But their fight didn't end with them leaving the church. Their story didn't conclude the moment they walked out those doors. Their fight for justice, for change, was just beginning. Mark and Lisa's story is a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference. We all have the ability to stand up when we see injustice, to speak out when we witness hate, and to show love when the world feels divided. It's not always easy, it's not always comfortable, but it is always worth it. And this is where you come in. The story doesn't end here. The story continues with you. So, I want to hear from you. What would you do? Would you take a stand? Would you raise your voice? Would you fight for what's right, even when it feels like you're standing alone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your story matters. We want to hear what you think. If you believe, like Mark and Lisa, that love and inclusion are the foundations of a truly strong community, if you believe that standing up for what's right can change the world, don't forget to like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Because stories like this, they have the power to change hearts, to spark conversations, to inspire action. And together, we can be the change the world so desperately needs.